Now we're going to turn our attention again to the Caribbean colony of Santo Domingo, which was a French colony located on the island of Hispaniola, which is, of course, the island where Columbus first set foot. Now, today, the western part of that island is the nation of Haiti, and the eastern part is the Dominican Republic. In the 1700s, the western part was the French colony Santo Domingo, and the eastern part was the Spanish colony Santo Domingo, which had been established by Christopher Columbus. All right, well, this colony and the sugar and coffee plantations on it essentially was the crown jewel of the French economy. It provided more money to France than any of its colonies, so therefore it was obviously very important. And we've talked before about the harsh conditions of slavery on those Caribbean colonies, no matter which European power was in charge. Well, as of the 1790s, early 1790s, there were about 40,000 white French people living in the colony, divided into two groups, the Grand Blanc and the Petit Blanc. That is, the big whites and the little whites, or the upper class and the lower class. There were also about 28,000 gens de couleur, people of color, that is, free blacks. It was fairly common in Santo Domingo, just as it was also in Louisiana when it was under French control, for white French slave owners who had female slaves who had borne children to them, racially mixed children. It's fairly common for them to free those children, and often their mothers, and even to make those children officially part of their family. A lot more likely to see that in French colonies than in English colonies. So as a result, just like in New Orleans, there was a large class of usually well-to-do, biracial African, well, not really African Americans, Franco-Africans, French people, black French people. All right, there were also about 600,000 esclaves, or slaves, way, way, way outnumbering the free people. Well, we're going to start our story here in 1789, which was the year that the new U.S. government took office, and also the year of the French Revolution, which did away with a monarchy and established a republic. The legislative group controlling France, the French National Assembly, in 1789 issued a document called the Declarations of the Rights of Men. Now, I have some of the items here from that document translated into English. There were a lot more articles than this, but I thought, these first few were important. Number one, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. Number two, the aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Number four, liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits except those which assure to the other members of the society the enjoyment of the same rights. So you can see the influence there of the Declaration of Independence and of all those French and English philosophers, Enlightenment philosophers, who had inspired people like Thomas Jefferson. So, broad sweeping statement, all men are equal and shall remain free and equal. Well, after the release of this statement, some of the gens de couleur, some of the free blacks in Saint-Domingue, felt like they should be able to freely exercise in all the rights of free Frenchmen, including voting there in the colony. Now, there had been the general feeling among the French people that they were establishing liberty, and that slavery was the opposite of liberty, and so free black people living in France were usually considered citizens just as much as white Frenchmen. But in the colonies in the Caribbean, which included Santo Domingo, Guadeloupe, and several other small islands, where these big plantations were being held, the plantation owners, who were French, had a lot of influence and a lot of sway, and they certainly didn't want to risk losing slavery, nor did they want a whole lot of rights to accrue to free black people, because that would make the slaves envious of freedom, and it would also disrupt that whole social hierarchy of slavery. So people like the black French citizens Julien Raymond and Vincent Auger, that is Auger on the left there, who were from Santo Domingo, traveled to France to try to raise support for the idea of full citizenship rights for free blacks in the colonies, and also an effort to get free black people represented in the political sphere. Well, Raymond and Auger and others like them made a good impression on a lot of people in France. And in particular, there was a French priest, Abbé Henri Grégoire, who met Julien Raymond and was very, very impressed by him and very impassioned by the situation in Santo Domingo. Henri Grégoire was a priest, but he was also very politically active. He's pretty radical. He served in politics and took up several causes that we would call social justice causes today. So Grégoire was one of the most prominent members of this group that was established there in France called the Société des Amis des Noirs, or the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, who lent their voice to people like Vincent Auger and Julien Raymond in efforts to get their rights recognized, but it didn't work. They were rebuffed because there was just too much money and too much influence from those elite plantation owners on Saint-Domingue and the other French colonies. So they went back home, and Auger decided to sort of take matters into his own hands, and he started organizing other free blacks into a militia whose goal was to rise up against the landowners, the elite white landowners in Saint-Domingue, and take over the colony. And actually, one of the people who was one of his closest advisors for military things in this was a free black man who had served in the French army during the American Revolution. So this revolution of their own was initiated, and it didn't get too far at all. They were pretty easily put down by the much larger militia raised by the French, composed mostly of the petits blancs, or working class French people on the island. Auger himself was executed. He was executed, I believe it was at the city of Port-au-Prince, out there in the open in front of everybody. He was broken on the wheel. That's where they take you and they tie you out across a large wagon wheel, and somebody gets like a sledgehammer and starts like beating on your limbs in between the spokes, so that you're, essentially breaking every bone in your body and causing you to very slowly and painfully die. So that was done to Vincent Auger. When there is an exceptionally cruel form of execution like that, the reasoning behind it is always because the people in authority want to prevent further rebellion. They want to dissuade anyone who even thinks about doing the things the person they've caught has done. And it's kind of similar to the English penalty for treason with the drawing and quartering. Now, sometimes that works. Sometimes it is a deterrent. But sometimes it backfires. Sometimes when you take a popular hero of the people and kill them in a painful, excruciating, and humiliating way, it doesn't scare everybody. It makes them more angry. And that's what happened with Vincent Auger. Over the next few months, the tensions continue to rise, not just with the free blacks, but with the slaves as well. And that leads us to an event that took place that started in August of 1791, a few months after Auger's death, that revolved around a slave named Dutty Boukman, who had originally been from Africa. He was captured and sold into slavery in Jamaica. He had actually been, before his capture, a Muslim cleric. So he was not only literate, he was extremely literate. And when he was in Jamaica, he got in trouble for teaching the other slaves to read and write by his masters, who sold him away off the island completely and sold him to Santo Domingo. And it was in Jamaica that he had gotten his new name, Dutty Boukman. Dutty Boukman. After arriving at Santo Domingo, he eventually became a Vodou priest, or Vodou priest, the traditional religion that sort of blended different parts of African culture with some parts of European culture, known as Obeah in the English colonies and Santeria in the Spanish. So he became a priest, a houngan. And on this night in August 1791, Boukman led a large ceremony with the slaves and runaway slaves, maroons, from various plantations in the area where he was, a voodoo ritual to essentially get them started on rebellion. And so the slaves from these plantations went home and killed the owners of the plantations, and they would kill them and take their weapons. And then they started moving down the road to other plantations, more and more people joining the group as they went, and killing more plantation owners and taking more weapons, until it was a full-scale revolt, similar to the Stono Revolt in North America earlier that century. Well, this kind of just exploded like a powder keg as groups of groups of slaves from all over the colony started to coalesce and to strike out against the French. And in a short time, these different groups of slaves progressed from being kind of just ad hoc groups that had been kind of informally thrown together to organized armies, even, as their number grew to over 100,000. And each of these armies had its own leaders, its own officers, its own generals. One person that we'll be talking about a little bit, who was probably the most capable of all of those slave army generals was this guy, Toussaint Louverture, which was a name he chose for himself. Toussaint is a common name, means All Saints. Louverture means the opening or the doorway or the beginning. So that was the name that he chose, and he proved to be very, very capable in this fighting. So within a few months, the situation was this. 24,000 white people had been killed. 100,000 black people had been killed. Now, 100,000 is more than 4 times more than 24,000. That's true. But that's 100,000 out of over 600,000 and 24,000 out of only 40,000. So more than half of the white people in the colony were killed during this. Well, the government in France decided, maybe we messed up. We have a volatile situation on our hands. They sent in troops to try to quell this rebellion, but to kind of calm down the black folks on the island, they stepped back and said, okay, we told you 3 years ago that free black people can't vote, but you know what? We'll let you vote. It was way too late for that. The free black people was just a tiny number of the people involved here. The slaves just wanted to not be slaves, right? As this was happening, France resumed its war with Great Britain and with Spain. They'd taken a little bit of a break. So this is around the time that the French and the British were stopping American merchant ships, and the British were kidnapping American sailors, if you'll recall. This war started, and Britain and Spain decided that this was a good time to try to seize this French colony. The French were the enemy, and the colony was in absolute chaos with this big slave revolt. So, the Spanish made an incursion into Santo Domingo. Toussaint Louverture initially sided with the Spanish because he was fighting already against the French. However, the French made Toussaint Louverture an offer, help France to defend this colony, and we promise to end slavery on this colony. Now, most of even the slaves who were fighting did not consider this a revolution to start a whole new country. They thought of themselves as black Frenchmen who should have the rights of other Frenchmen, including the right not to be a slave. Well, Louverture agrees, and France does, in fact, the following year, abolish slavery in France and in all of its colonies. By the way, some of the remaining white elite plantation owners, after the free blacks were given the right to vote by the French National Assembly, they had actually, some of them had contacted the British government and offered to help Britain take over the island because they were afraid the way things were going, France was going to abolish slavery, but they believed England would keep it. Well, that didn't help them because the combined forces of the French and the slave armies led by Louverture and others defeated the British and the Spanish, kicked the Spanish off the island there for a while, and raided into the Santo Domingo colony and freed every slave they found there, which wasn't all of them, but it was a large number. However, Louverture, having agreed to do this for the government of France, decided, he and others, that this was actually an ideal opportunity to break away from France altogether. So Toussaint Louverture called for an independent nation in what had previously been the French colony of Saint-Domingue. They wrote up a constitution. This did not please the leader of the French government, one Napoleon Bonaparte, who sent a force to defeat these rebels. The same thing was happening, by the way, in Guadeloupe, which was another French colony on an island in the Caribbean. The slaves of Guadeloupe had also been fighting and working to overthrow their masters, so French troops went to both places. In Guadeloupe, the leader of the slave resistance there was named Louis Delgrès, and he and his slave army were actually defeated by the French troops, who outnumbered them significantly. And making a final stand, Delgrès and his slave rebels took all the gunpowder that they had left and bunched it all together, I think it was on a beach, and then stood there around it and set it off and blew themselves up, rather than face the consequences that Napoleon had said was going to happen, which was slavery was to be reinstituted on the island of Guadeloupe. So they died rather than risk being slaves again. Meanwhile, Louverture was invited to come in and negotiate with the leaders of the French troops under a white flag of truce. You may notice that there's a pattern in this class. We've seen it already, and we'll see it again. Anytime you are a person of color, it's a bad idea to come in under a flag of truce, it seems, with any of these European groups and later Euro-American groups. This isn't the last time this is going to happen. So he was taken prisoner and shipped off to a prison in France, where just a few months later he died. Well, the French troops that had come in managed to maintain some control, but it was discovered, it was found out by some of the black people in Santo Domingo about the plans for Guadeloupe, that the plan had been to reinstitute slavery, and they're pretty sure, and they were right, Napoleon was planning to do the same thing in their colony and make them slaves again. So once again, they rose up in large numbers, and the French troops who had been sent there, turns out, were not real resistant to the malaria on that island. So a large number of the troops died of sickness. Well, once the slave army, this time led among others by Jean-Jacques Dessaline, rose up, Napoleon sent a large army to Haiti. By the way, the army that the British had sent to Haiti in that fighting earlier was the largest army they had they had ever sent anywhere up to that time. So France sends a pretty large army. Unfortunately, they also, many of them, fall victim to sickness. In fact, they had a bunch of Polish soldiers who had made an alliance with Napoleon's France. Like 5,000, I think 4,000 of them died of yellow fever. The rest of them didn't do very well fighting against these Haitian armies who had essentially been fighting nonstop for 10 years. So they'd gotten pretty good at it. Then they were aided by the whole disease situation, which is also a bit of poetic justice for this particular island, if you remember what happened to the Taino and the other people, the other native peoples who encountered the Spanish and were decimated by disease. Well, the French army was just slaughtered. Napoleon couldn't really send another army because he was busy fighting the British and everybody else. So they just had to kind of let it go. They had to let Santo Domingo go. And the former slave armies not only took control of the colony, they took control of the government of the colony and established it as an independent republic. And they renamed it from Santo Domingo to, well, in English it's pronounced Haiti, Haiti. In French, it's pronounced Haiti. The name of this island, Hispaniola, the name it was called by the Taino people who had lived there, was Haiti. So essentially they restored its original name. Dessaline became the first governor general of the island. A few months later declared himself emperor. He wasn't a very nice guy to start with. He actually embarked on a campaign to kill all the remaining white people on the island, traveling personally from place to place to see that it was carried out. Now, a large number of the white French people had left the island at the initial defeat of the French army. Many of them went to Louisiana, and many of those white French people still had control over their slaves or their house servants, and took them along. And this is how the Haitian religion of Vodou traveled to New Orleans and became very big in New Orleans. Anyway, it's estimated 4,000 or 5,000 white French people were killed after the situation with Dessaline taking over, who, after a couple of years, was assassinated by some of the free, the gens de couleur, the more well-to-do biracial black people there on the island. And really, after more than 10 years of fighting, the island was virtually destroyed, all of its resources. So they were in a pretty rough spot. But this is how Haiti, or Haiti, became only the third independent republic, the independent democratic republic in the world at that time, the second one in the Western Hemisphere, the other two being the U.S. and France. Well, why am I talking so much about the Haitian Revolution when this is U.S. history? Because there's going to be large impacts on the United States as a result of this. A big cultural impact in New Orleans, which I just talked about. Let's take a look at how the government reacted. Government of the United States. John Adams, who at this point was no longer president, he had lost that 1800 election. John Adams was all for the French Revolution. He thought the Haitian Revolution. He wasn't for the French Revolution, but he was for the Haitian Revolution. He thought it was great. In part because, if you'll recall, John Adams was very pro-England and very anti-France. So this slave revolution really stuck it to France. But he also looked at this as an opportunity to open up trade, very lucrative trade, to get some of that sugar and to get some of that coffee and things without having to deal with the French, by dealing directly with the Haitians. By the way, Vincent Auger was the guy that was killed early on. He was 1/4 black. They used the term in English mulatto for biracial, but they had even more specific words. If you were 1/4 black, you had one black grandparent, you were called a quadroon, or quadroon. If you had one black great-grandparent, you were called an octoroon, and so forth. Anyway, Auger he owned a large coffee plantation he had inherited from his white French father. So Adams thinks it's great. Thomas Jefferson, who was president at this time, well, now stop for a second. Remember, this is Thomas Jefferson, who tends to side with the common people more so than John Adams would, certainly, who also loves a good revolution wherever it happens. Loved the French Revolution. Remember, he made all those comments about how you have to have a good revolution now and then to water the tree of liberty with the blood of tyrants and patriots. Never saw a revolution against elitist autocratic rule that he didn't like until this one. For some reason, Thomas Jefferson did not approve of the Haitian Revolution. Can't imagine what that reason might have been. And of course, I'm being sarcastic. The reason is it was slaves. Slaves rebelling. Jefferson did not like that, and as president, he refused, and because he was president, the U.S. government refused to recognize Haiti as a country for a very long time. Meanwhile, that whole campaign of vengeance that Dessaline had engaged in against the white French population that was left, that terrified white Southerners, because if such a slave revolt could happen on such a large scale and work, it could happen in South Carolina or Georgia or Virginia. So they began to be even paranoid about their slaves. And I'm not just talking about white slave owners, but I'm talking about white people in the South in general who were invested in the economy created by cotton and slavery in the process of being created at that time. So the fear was, what if something like that happened here? And that leads us to this guy, a slave named Gabriel, sometimes called Gabriel Prosser because the guy who owned him, his last name was Prosser. Gabriel was a slave in Virginia who was a blacksmith and was very good at it. In fact, his master rented him out to do blacksmithing work off the plantation, and he often sent him to the city to do blacksmithing work there. So Gabriel got to meet a lot of different people, got to make connections. He also got to, hear the news about Haiti. The fear was that what if American slaves were inspired by that revolution? Gabriel was inspired by that revolution, and he and his two brothers started organizing a revolt of their own. Now, he had some interesting orders for the other people who were going to be involved. Just like the slaves in Haiti, they're going to strike out against the plantation owners. They're going to kill a bunch of people. But Gabriel said, under no circumstances should you kill any Quakers, because Quakers at this point were, all abolitionists. They were opposed to slavery. Also, don't kill any Methodists. I think he was Methodist, but he had been helped out by a lot of white Methodists in the South who had sympathy for slaves. So don't kill Quakers, don't kill Methodists, don't kill any French people, because he was inspired by, again, the Haitian Revolution, and he believed that the French Revolution was also inspiring. And so, therefore, the French were fellow revolutionaries. He didn't say kill everybody else, but he said you can kill anybody else other than these folks. So, plan was, I think this was in August, plan was at a certain time, just like with Dutty Boukman in Haiti, everyone was going to rise up. But it rained really, really hard that weekend. I mean, it was raining hard. So the insurrection was called off on account of rain. It was postponed for a week, which was unfortunate because with that extra week, a couple of the slaves who had been involved in the plot had time to start to get worried about what might happen if it didn't work, and start to get suspicious that their owners were suspicious of them. So a couple of these slaves got cold feet and went to the authorities and told on the others, who were very quickly arrested. Now, Gabriel's rebellion never actually happened. Didn't take place. It was caught before it could start. Although if it hadn't rained that weekend, there would have been some rebelling for sure. Gabriel, by the way, managed to slip away from the people sent to arrest him, escaped on a boat, but then was betrayed by another slave he encountered who figured out who he was and knew there was a reward for him. So the slave turned him in, and then the slave was only given part of the reward because he's a slave. Anyway, Gabriel was hanged. By the way, that is the proper way to say that word when you're talking about execution. Things are hung up, but an execution is hanged. So they hanged Bob and he just hung there. Remember that. Anyway, also, in addition to him, 25 other slaves were executed, and the paranoia of white Southerners ratcheted up significantly. And just like the wake of the Stono Rebellion, half a century before, this resulted in harsher laws being enacted in all southern states, but especially in Virginia, harsher laws restricting the rights and the quality of life of not only slaves, but free black people. Now, another thing that I didn't mention about Gabriel is that he had been taught to read by his owners. So one of these laws in Virginia makes it illegal to teach a slave to read, and also made it much, much more difficult to free your slaves, even if you wanted to. And in the years after the Revolution, in the South, more and more people were deciding to free their slaves, which is how this sort of whole group of free blacks grew so much. So that was the immediate result, and we're going to see that again. There's a rebellion or an attempted rebellion, and things get worse.